Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Run, Walk, Talk Tales of Inclusion and Development. I'm Judy Borvich, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm here with Steph Redivo, and her pronouns are she, her. And we are super excited for today because we are going to be talking about a subject that's near and dear to both of our hearts, which is psychological safety and what it means from a learning lens and from an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. So, Steph, let's just jump right in. How do
hmm
you define psychological safety from an inclusion perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think, both Amy Edmondson and Tim Cook, they have written really great books about psych safety. I do like Tim Cook's definition, and sort of he sets it up as a condition where you feel included, safe to learn, safe to contribute, and safe to challenge the status quo. And I really think of that last one about being safe to challenge the status quo as something that is so crucial in organizations. What about you?
No, absolutely. I love that. Well, and I'm right with you with Amy Edmondson and Tim. And I love Amy's definition. She wrote one of the seminal books on psych safety, as you know. I think you're the one who recommended it to me in the first
hmm
place, which was The Fearless Organization. And she really says that, psych safety is confidence that a team won't embarrass or reject us for speaking up, and a climate that is characterized by trust and mutual respect where people can be themselves. So that really, what you said about the status quo, you're free to challenge it, you're free to speak your mind. And really, there's not going to be then a meeting after the meeting. You can actually say what you mean in the meeting, and you know that people might disagree with you, but they're not going to, reject you or cast you aside. So if we're thinking about, what does that really mean and look like in organizations, what does a psychologically safe workplace look like to you? What would it feel like?
Yeah, so recently I witnessed a leader apologizing in a meeting for not bringing in the right stakeholders and providing additional time for feedback.
Mm,
And I really thought that was extremely powerful because when someone is in power and admits those mistakes, right, it shows to the others and the colleagues and everybody below that it's okay and encouraged to make mistakes. So I think that's kind of one example. I've also seen where, again, there's the dynamic between a leader and a colleague or an employee where an employee is able to provide negative or constructive feedback. And the example I like to use is kind of in product development, when an employee can kind of step up and say, I think we're missing some voices here with different lived experience. I don't think we have everybody here. And I think we need to go out and engage other stakeholders to make our product better. And I think there is a moment there for the leader to kind of, either go one of two ways. And one is to thank the employee and take a moment and say, you know what, you're right. We missed that. Let's take some time,
hmm
which then builds that sort of trust so that an employee can kind of speak up again. Or sometimes could go in the opposite way of defensiveness. We don't have time. Why didn't you do that? You should have known that. And then it sets the employee up for not speaking up again. They won't do that again, you know?
Well, what I really like about both of those examples, and I think in particular the first example is, and this goes to setting us up for being a learning organization, is as a leader, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
As a subject matter expert, you have a certain level of expertise, but again, it doesn't mean that you have to know absolutely everything.
Yeah.
We're all going to make mistakes, and I think that there's a courage and a vulnerability in admitting that and not being defensive
Mm-hmm.
about it.
Yeah. I mean, it does sound sort of nice to be like, just go ahead, leaders, create that psych safe, environment. But it's hard and a lot of work. So, Judy, share with us kind of what challenges do you see?
Well, I think in a psychologically safe environment, first and foremost, you'll see open and healthy conflict. You'll see a lot of
Mm,
conversation where people are challenging each
mm-hmm,
other, and that can be
mm-hmm.
difficult because a lot of us, myself included, can struggle with conflict. We can feel
Yeah,
uncomfortable in conflict. And I think in a psychologically safe environment, it really requires that we be open and understand that there's going to be conflict with us and people that we work with. That's part of being in an organization. And I think too, psychological safety in a workplace can require that there is a shift in the organizational culture.
mm,
And those sorts of shifts can be very complex and they don't necessarily happen overnight. And so it really requires a commitment on the part of the organization to put time and effort in.
yeah,
You mentioned that it's not something you can't just say in a meeting, everybody feel free to speak, and suddenly it happens. It's
yeah,
something that you have to not only say it, but you've got to, walk the talk. So you've got to show people that you can be trusted as a leader. And if we think about, traditional environments, maybe environments that have a hierarchy, um, a psychological safety that doing that shift, it can shift the power dynamics in an
mm-hmm,
organization as well, and that can be challenging for people. So I completely agree with you. I think leaders play this vital role in building psychological safety in a workplace. As you said, we're talking about challenging and changing the status quo, and that's not easy necessarily to do. How about for
yeah.
you?
Yeah, I think what was coming up for me is this idea of, traditionally leaders have, you've been rewarded as an individual contributor who's done really great work, and you sort of move up the ranks by just taking on more work and doing well and hitting whatever targets those are. And I really think the definition of leadership has changed, and the
Yes.
expectations of the different generations on what leadership is. And I think our leaders, our leaders in our like 40s, 50s, 60s grew up in a different time than what this sort of new kind of the Gen Zs going into the workforce are expecting of our leaders. And
Hmm.
they absolutely won't put up with potentially what might have, it wasn't okay back then, but what was put up with, right? So
Yeah.
leaders have to sort of be very kind of self-aware and realize what are their trigger points and what are some things that they need to work on to create that environment.
Well, and as
Yeah,
somebody who's in Gen X, I mean, again, it goes to that whole learning mindset. You've got
yeah,
to be continually open, self-aware, as you're saying, and open to growing and learning and changing. And I love some of the changes that the Gen Z are bringing in to the
yes,
workplace. It's very exciting to see what they're bringing. So on our runs, we talk an awful lot about the role of leadership and what leaders can do. So how can employees potentially. So let's say we know it's really important for leadership to drive psychological safety, but as an employee within an organization, what can you do?
yeah, I think so. If the leaders are sort of sharing and admitting mistakes and displaying kind of curiosity and walking the talk, I think our employees can do the same with each other, right? I think our employees can discuss failures and bring things to the team. Um, and I think those are kind of expectations that you can set up whenever you're working on projects and getting started, right? It's this expectation that we're going to disagree, and we want to disagree and debate things because that makes it better. And I think you kind of talked a little bit about how hard it is to the issue of conflict is difficult, and we can say be okay with being uncomfortable, but in reality, being uncomfortable in the moment is a hard thing to get used to, right? And it takes
Hmm.
practice. Yeah.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm just thinking about, I love the idea that employees individually or collectively can drive change within an organization versus the change being driven by those at the top. I mean, ideally, you would have the change, psychological safety coming from the leadership, and they do have a critical role to play in establishing it. But I would say if you're an employee in an organization, and you're not in a formal leadership position, you can be an informal leader for driving psych safety. You can model it. You can be open and transparent in your communication. You can listen and ask questions. You can collaborate and share knowledge as much as possible. I would also acknowledge, though, that if the organization is extremely toxic and not safe, it may be time to think about potentially departing the organization. Like, I think there's, depending what the organization is like, there are certain steps you can take, see what happens, do a little bit of experimentation. But if the organization is truly toxic, I would caution people to be careful within an organization. What
I
do you
mean that
think?
yeah, that's so true. And I think we don't discuss that point enough as to when is it time to go, that you've done everything that you
Hmm.
can. And hey, we know that there's certain things we might not like to do in our job, and we all have our various sort of definitions of what a toxic environment is. There's been a ton of research though, right, that
Yeah.
shows. And so yeah, you have to figure out when is it time to go and how you can protect yourself. And so the one thing, maybe as we sort of, get into kind of our actionable step, or I'll sort of share a bit of an actionable step for everyone here, and a bit of a learning moment around, you know, you will know in your gut. And I know we don't always want to go with our gut, but in this situation, you will know when, if you do not feel safe,
Hmm.
then don't speak up. You need to protect yourself for sure. I mean, that's the one thing that I would say, um, in an environment that lends itself to not be safe. What about
Hmm.
you?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, there's lots of things that I'm thinking of, and I love that you mentioned that gut instinct and that feeling, and I think that there's data that, when
Yeah,
you get that gut feeling, there's some internal data that you're collecting and getting and
right.
observing, and so I love that. And I think too, thinking about psychological safety and inclusion and how important it is to feel included. And also, as we've just spoken about, that if it's not there, what are some steps you can take to make sure that you are safe in an environment? And in some cases, it may be, as we're talking about, potentially, exiting an organization.
Hmm. So, Judy, this kind of really brings us to a bit of a wrap. I think, we've talked a lot about psych safety. I think if we think about that actionable item that I'm going to take, I think I'm going to check in with my team this week, coming up to see, how they're feeling, what's going on, what are some additional things that I can do as a leader to
Yeah, no,
create a
I
more
love that.
psych. Yeah. What about
Uh,
you?
Well, I think for me, it's going to be maybe speaking less in meetings and inviting voice
Mm.
more in
Mm-hmm.
meetings. And
Mm-hmm.
certainly, if there are, people who aren't speaking in the meeting, inviting them in
Yes.
to speak and share, whether that is, speaking aloud in the meeting, or we do a lot of virtual meetings, so it may be, sharing something in a chat, but inviting voice in whatever way feels comfortable for that particular person.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.